The community center smelled like old wood and fresh coffee. David stood backstage, his hands shaking as he peeked through the worn curtain at the crowd filling up the seats. He counted maybe 200 people, possibly more. His stomach twisted into knots. What was he thinking? A construction worker who'd barely touched a piano in his life, about to perform in front of half the neighborhood. He pulled his hand back from the curtain and looked down at his palms. They were rough, covered in calluses from years of swinging hammers and carrying lumber. These weren't pianist's hands. These were working man's hands, and they were sweating like crazy right now. "Daddy, you're going to be amazing." His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, appeared beside him, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She wore a yellow dress, the one with little flowers on it. The one her mom had picked out for her 5th birthday party, back when things were different. Back when their house was full of laughter and music and warmth. David knelt down to her level, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. "You really think so, kiddo?" "I know so," Lily said with the absolute confidence only a child could have. She threw her arms around his neck, squeezing tight. "I'm going to sit right in the front row and watch you the whole time." His sister, Rachel, appeared from around the corner, gently taking Lily's hand. "Come on, sweetie. Let's get you to your seat. Your dad needs to get ready." As they walked away, Lily turned back one more time, giving him a thumbs up and the biggest smile he'd seen on her face in months. That smile was the only reason he was still here, the only reason he hadn't run out the back door 10 minutes ago. David walked over to the piano, sitting in the middle of the backstage area. They'd moved it back here for the performers to warm up. He sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly, then stared at the keys. The black and white pattern that had terrified him 3 weeks ago now felt familiar under his fingertips. "You're the construction guy, right?" A teenage kid with spiky hair and a guitar case walked past him. "That's pretty cool, man. My dad works construction too. He says he could never do something like this." David managed a weak smile. "Yeah, well, we'll see how it goes." The kid moved on, and David was alone again with the piano and his racing thoughts. He pressed one key gently, then another. The sound was so pure, so clear. His wife, Jennifer, had always said that about piano music. She said it cut right through all the noise in the world and went straight to your heart. He could almost hear her voice now, gentle and encouraging. Jennifer had been the musical one in their family. She'd played piano since she was 5 years old. Their tiny apartment used to be filled with music every evening after dinner. She'd sit at her old upright piano, the one her grandmother had given her, and play everything from classical pieces to pop songs. Lily would dance around the living room, and David would watch them both, feeling like the luckiest man alive. Then came the accident. A rainy night, a truck that ran a red light, and just like that the music stopped. The piano sat silent in their living room for 18 months. David couldn't bring himself to play it. Couldn't even look at it most days. It was just this big, painful reminder of everything they'd lost. 5 minutes to showtime. A woman with a clipboard called out, making David jump. His heart started hammering even harder. He stood up from the piano and walked to the small mirror hanging on the backstage wall. The face looking back at him seemed older than his 38 years. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His brown hair was starting to show gray at the temples. He wore his only nice shirt, a blue button-up that was slightly too tight around the shoulders from all the physical work he did. David splashed some water on his face from a nearby bottle and took a deep breath. Then another. Then another. His hands were still shaking. Through the curtain, he could hear the crowd settling down. The show was starting. The first performer was a young girl doing a dance routine to some pop song. The audience clapped along, encouraging her. Then came a comedy act that got some laughs. Then a man juggling. Each act brought the moment closer when David would have to walk out there. He thought about that morning 3 weeks ago, when everything changed. He'd woken up early as usual, planning to head to the construction site by 6. But as he walked past Lily's room, he heard something that made him stop. She was crying. Not loud, dramatic crying, but that quiet, heartbroken kind that's somehow worse. He'd pushed open her door gently. Lily was sitting on her bed, holding a picture of her mom. The morning light coming through the window made her look so small, so fragile. "Baby girl, what's wrong?" he'd asked, sitting beside her. She'd looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Why don't we have music anymore, Daddy?" Mommy loved music. She would want us to have music. Those words had hit him like a punch to the gut. He realized that in trying to protect himself from the pain, He'd taken away something precious from his daughter. The apartment had been silent for so long. No piano, no singing, no joy. Just the sound of the TV and their quiet dinners and the absence of everything that used to make their house feel like home. That night, after Lily went to bed, David had walked to the piano. His hands had trembled as he lifted the cover over the keys. He sat down on the bench, the same bench where Jennifer used to sit, and he cried. Really cried for the first time since the funeral. Then he'd noticed something tucked inside the piano bench. When he opened it, he found all of Jennifer's old lesson books, the ones from when she was learning as a kid. And there, paper clipped to the front of the first book, was a note in her handwriting. His breath had caught when he saw it. The note said, "For David, if you ever want to learn. Remember, music isn't about being perfect. It's about feeling something and sharing it with the world. That's what makes it beautiful. I love you. Jay." His wife had left him a message, a bridge between their old life and whatever came next. She'd known somehow that he might need this someday. The next morning, he'd called Mrs. Peterson, Jennifer's old piano teacher. She was retired now, living a few blocks away. When he explained what he wanted to do, she'd agreed to teach him immediately. She even refused to take any payment, saying that Jennifer had been one of her favorite students and she'd be honored to help. "David Miller, you're up next," the clipboard woman called out, snapping him back to the present moment. This was it. No more time to overthink or panic or run away. David walked toward the stage entrance, his legs feeling like rubber. He could hear the current performer finishing up, the crowd applauding. His mouth was completely dry. His heart felt like it might explode out of his chest. Then he saw Lily through the gap in the curtain. She was sitting in the front row, just like she promised, her little face full of hope and excitement. She was wearing the yellow dress and clapping enthusiastically for the performer on stage. When she noticed someone walking off stage, she sat up even straighter, knowing her dad was next. David took one more deep breath. He thought about Jennifer, about that note, about all those early morning practice sessions when his fingers ached and he wanted to quit. He thought about why he was really doing this. Not for the crowd, not to prove anything to himself, but to show his daughter that even when life breaks your heart, you can still find a way to make something beautiful. The announcer's voice came over the speakers. "Our next performer is David Miller, playing an original arrangement on piano. Let's give him a warm welcome." The curtain opened. The stage lights hit him bright and hot. The crowd was a blur of faces. And there, right in the middle of the front row, was Lily, beaming up at him like he was the bravest person in the world. David walked to the piano and sat down, adjusting the bench one last time. His hands found the keys. The audience fell silent, waiting. This was the moment that would change everything. The last 2 years had been the hardest of David's life. And that was saying something, considering he'd grown up with very little and worked his way up from nothing. But losing Jennifer, that was different. That was a kind of pain he didn't know existed until it swallowed him whole. The first few months after the accident were just a blur. He remembered people bringing casseroles and saying things that were supposed to be comforting, but just made him feel worse. He remembered sitting at the funeral, holding Lily's hand while she asked why Mommy wasn't waking up. He remembered going back to work after 2 weeks because he had to, because the bills didn't stop coming just because your world fell apart. Construction work became his escape. The physical labor felt good in a strange way. When your body hurts, you don't think about the emotional pain as much. He started taking extra shifts, working weekends, volunteering for overtime whenever it was available. His boss, Tony, tried to tell him to slow down, but David couldn't. If he slowed down, he'd have to think. If he had to think, he'd remember. And if he remembered, he didn't know if he could keep going. The medical bills from Jennifer's hospital stay had piled up despite their insurance. Even though she hadn't survived, those final days in intensive care had cost more than David made in a year. He'd sold Jennifer's car first, then most of their furniture. The apartment started looking emptier and emptier. But he couldn't sell the piano. He tried. He even had a guy come look at it, ready to hand over cash. But when the man touched he keys. David heard Jennifer's favorite melody in his head, and he told the guy to leave. Lily started staying with his sister Rachel after school most days. Sometimes she'd spend weekends with Jennifer's parents, who lived about an hour away. David told himself it was temporary, that he was just getting back on his feet. But the truth was, he didn't know how to be a dad anymore. He didn't know how to make Lily smile. Every time he looked at her, he saw Jennifer's eyes, Jennifer's expressions, and the grief would hit him all over again. Dinner became whatever was easiest. Frozen pizzas, takeout when he could afford it, cereal sometimes. They'd eat in front of the TV, not talking much. Lily stopped asking him questions about his day. She stopped showing him her drawings from school. Slowly, quietly, she was disappearing too, just in a different way. David noticed but didn't know how to fix it. He'd watch her sitting on the couch, so quiet and still. Nothing like the bouncing, singing, laughing little girl she used to be. The guilt ate at him. He knew he was failing her. He knew Jennifer would be heartbroken if she could see how he was handling things. But he felt trapped, like he was drowning and couldn't figure out which way was up. His coworkers tried to help in their own way. They'd invite him out for beers after work, but he'd always say no. They'd ask about Lily and he'd give short answers. They eventually stopped pushing, though he'd catch them giving him concerned looks when they thought he wasn't paying attention. The only person who kept pushing was Tony, his foreman. Tony was older, in his 50s, and had been through his own share of hard times. One day, about a year after Jennifer's death, Tony pulled David aside during lunch. "You're working yourself to death, kid," Tony had said, his voice gruff but kind. "I'm fine," David replied automatically. That's what he always said. "I'm fine. Getting better. Hanging in there. All lies but easier than the truth." "No, you're not," Tony said flatly. "And that little girl of yours needs her dad back." David had wanted to argue, but the words got stuck in his throat. Instead, he just looked down at his boots covered in concrete dust. Tony sighed. "I get it. I really do. But you can't run from grief forever. Eventually, you gotta stop and face it, or it'll destroy you." David had nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and they'd gone back to work. But Tony's words stuck with him, nagging at him during those long, quiet nights in the apartment. Then came that morning 3 weeks ago, the one that changed everything. He'd been up since 4:30, unable to sleep like usual. He was getting ready for work, moving through the dark apartment quietly so he wouldn't wake Lily. But when he passed her room, he heard crying. His heart dropped. He pushed open the door gently. The early morning light was just starting to come through the window, that gray light before sunrise. Lily was sitting on her bed in her pajamas, holding a framed photo of Jennifer. Her small shoulders were shaking and tears were running down her face silently. "Lily, baby, what's wrong?" David asked, immediately sitting beside her and pulling her close. She leaned into him, her voice small and broken. "I miss Mommy. I know, sweetheart. I miss her too. But Daddy," Lily looked up at him with those big eyes, "why don't we have music anymore? Mommy loved music so much. She played piano every day. Now it's just quiet all the time. It makes me feel like we're forgetting her." The words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. The apartment had been silent for 18 months. He'd avoided the piano like it was cursed. He'd stopped playing music on his phone or the radio because it hurt too much. He'd taken away the very thing that Jennifer had loved most, trying to protect himself from pain, and in doing so, he'd taken it away from Lily too. "I'm sorry," he whispered, pulling her tighter. "I'm so sorry, baby girl." They sat there for a long time, just holding each other while the sun came up. David called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. He made Lily her favorite breakfast, pancakes with chocolate chips. They ate together, actually talking, actually present with each other in a way they hadn't been in months. After breakfast, Lily went to brush her teeth, and David found himself walking to the piano. He stood in front of it for a while, his heart pounding. The cover over the keys had a thin layer of dust on it. He reached out and lifted it slowly, revealing the keys underneath. Black and white, unchanged, waiting patiently like old friends. David sat down on the bench. It felt strange, sitting where Jennifer used to sit. He touched one key, then another. The notes rang out in the apartment, the first music in so long. It sounded like hope. It also sounded like pain, both at the same time. He opened the bench where Jennifer used to store her sheet music, looking for something, though he wasn't sure what. That's when he found the lesson books, 5 of them, arranged in order from beginner to advanced. They were old, worn at the corners, with Jennifer's teenage handwriting in the margins where she'd made notes to herself. And paperclipped to the first book was an envelope. David's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a note in Jennifer's handwriting, dated just a few weeks before the accident. His vision blurred as he read it. "For David, if you ever want to learn," it said. "I know you always said you weren't musical, but I never believed that. Music isn't about being perfect or naturally talented. It's about feeling something and having the courage to express it. That's what makes it beautiful. The piano isn't just mine. It's ours. Our family's. Teach Lily someday. And if you want, let it teach you too. All my love, always and forever, Jay." David's chest felt tight. Jennifer had left this for him. She'd known somehow that there might come a day when he'd need permission to begin again. Permission to try something new. Permission to let music back into their lives. He sat at that piano for an hour, just touching the keys randomly, not making real music, but making sound. Lily came and sat beside him at one point, resting her head on his shoulder, listening quietly. When David's fingers stumbled on a simple melody, Lily smiled. It was small, but it was real. That afternoon, David looked up piano teachers in their area. Most charged rates he couldn't afford. But then he remembered Mrs. Peterson, Jennifer's old teacher. She'd been at the funeral, had hugged him and told him to call if he ever needed anything. He'd never called, too proud and too buried in grief. Now he pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the card she'd given him 2 years ago. She answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Peterson, this is David Miller, Jennifer's husband, David. Oh my goodness, how are you? How's your daughter?" "We're hanging in there," he said, and for once it didn't feel like a complete lie. "Listen, I know this is going to sound strange, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to teach me piano. I found some of Jennifer's old lesson books, and I thought maybe I could learn." There was a pause on the other end. Then Mrs. Peterson's voice came back, warm and excited. "David, I would be honored. Jennifer was one of my favorite students ever. Teaching her husband would be a privilege. When can you start?" They arranged for her to come by the apartment twice a week. When David mentioned payment, she stopped him immediately. "Absolutely not. This is something I want to do. For Jennifer's memory." The first lesson was awkward. David's fingers felt too big and clumsy for the delicate work. Mrs. Peterson, a tiny woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and endless patience, showed him basic hand positions and simple scales. It was frustrating. His fingers didn't want to do what his brain told them to do. "This is harder than carrying 100-pound beams," he joked nervously. Mrs. Peterson smiled. "Different muscles. Different kind of strength. But you'll get there." Jennifer started just like this when she was 7 years old. That became David's motivation. If Jennifer could learn this, so could he. If his 7-year-old daughter could believe in him, he could believe in himself. He started practicing every morning before work. He'd set his alarm for 4:30, make coffee, and sit at the piano in the dark, working through scales and simple exercises with headphones on so he wouldn't wake Lily. His fingers hurt at first, sore from the unfamiliar movements. The guys at work noticed him flexing his hands during breaks and teased him about it. "What, you get soft hands now, Miller?" one of them joked. "Learning piano," David said simply, and the teasing stopped. Something about the way he said it made them understand it was important. Tony, his foreman, pulled him aside one day during lunch. "Piano, huh? That's good, David. That's really good. My mom played piano. Some of my best childhood memories are of her playing after dinner." It turned out Tony knew music better than anyone would have guessed. He even gave David tips about rhythm and timing, comparing it to the rhythm of construction work, the way everything had to flow together to make something solid. The lessons with Mrs. Peterson continued. She was patient but firm, praising his effort but never letting him take shortcuts. She taught him one piece at a time, making sure he understood it deeply before moving on. About 2 weeks in, she brought out a specific piece of sheet music. "This," she said, "is what Jennifer played at her wedding. She told me you loved it." David recognized it immediately. It was a classical piece, something by Chopin, but Jennifer had added her own touches to it. He remembered standing at the front of that small church watching her walk down the aisle, and then later at their tiny reception, listening to her play this for their handful of guests. "I can." "Play that?" David said, feeling overwhelmed just looking at the complex notes on the page. "Not yet," Mrs. Peterson agreed. "But you will. This is going to be your goal." And it became his North Star. Every morning, every practice session, he worked toward being able to play that piece. Some days were better than others. Some days his fingers cooperated and the music actually sounded like music. Other days he wanted to quit, frustrated by his own limitations, but Lily kept him going. She started listening when he practiced. She'd sit on the couch with a book, and even though she was reading, he could tell she was listening. Sometimes she'd smile when he got a part right. Once, when he messed up badly and said a word he shouldn't have said in front of her, she giggled. Actual giggling. He hadn't heard that sound in so long. Slowly, the apartment started feeling different. There was music again. There were moments of lightness. Lily started talking more at dinner, telling him about school. He started actually listening, asking questions, being present. The piano became the thing that brought them back to each other. The thing that reminded them both that life could still have joy in it, even after loss. 3 weeks might not sound like a long time to learn piano, especially for someone who'd never played before. But for David, those 3 weeks felt like a lifetime. Every single morning, he'd wake up in the dark at 4:30 and make his way to the piano while the rest of the world slept. The early morning became his favorite time. There was something peaceful about it, something sacred. He'd sit on the bench with a cup of coffee beside him, wearing the headphones Mrs. Peterson had lent him so the sound wouldn't wake Lily. The apartment would be completely quiet, except for the notes he heard in his ears. Outside, the street was empty. Inside, it was just him and the piano and Jennifer's memory. His fingers hurt those first few days. Really hurt. The tips were sore from pressing the keys, and his hands ached from holding the proper position. He'd never thought about piano playing as physical work, but it was. Different from construction, but physical nonetheless. He found himself rubbing his hands during the day, working out the soreness. At the construction site, the guys noticed. Danny, who worked on his crew, caught him flexing his fingers during a break one day. "You all right there, Dave? Your hands cramping up?" "Learning piano," David explained, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Turns out it's harder than it looks." The response surprised him. Instead of teasing, Danny looked genuinely interested. "No kidding? That's pretty cool, man. My daughter takes piano lessons. She's always trying to get me to learn too, but I keep telling her I'm too old." "I'm 38 and just started," David said with a slight smile. "So you're probably not too old." Word spread through the crew quickly. By lunch, everyone knew David was learning piano. Most of them thought it was great. A couple guys gave him good-natured ribbing, but it was friendly, not mean. To David's surprise, his foreman Tony approached him at the end of the day. "Hey David, you got a minute?" They walked away from the other workers. Tony pulled out his phone and showed David a video of a young woman playing piano at what looked like a concert hall. "That's my daughter, Nicole," Tony said proudly. "She's a music teacher now down in Florida. Been playing since she was 5. David watched the video, impressed. "She's really talented." "Yeah, she is. But you know what? When she first started, she cried at almost every lesson. Said her fingers hurt, said it was too hard, said she wanted to quit. My wife and I had to practically bribe her to keep going for the first year." Tony put his phone away. "What I'm saying is, nobody starts out good. The fact that you're doing this at all, especially after everything you've been through, that takes guts. Don't give up when it gets hard." Those words stuck with David. Every morning when his alarm went off and he wanted to hit snooze, he thought about what Tony said. When his fingers refused to hit the right notes and frustration built up in his chest, he remembered that even talented people struggled at first. Mrs. Peterson came twice a week like she promised, always arriving with her worn music bag and a thermos of tea. She never seemed rushed, even though David knew she was busy. She'd sit beside him at the piano, her practiced hands showing him the movements, her patient voice explaining the theory behind what he was playing. "Music isn't just about hitting the right notes," she told him during their 4th lesson. "It's about the spaces between the notes too, the rhythm, the feeling. You can play every note perfectly and still miss the soul of the piece." David wasn't sure he understood what she meant at first. Notes were notes, right? But as he practiced more, he started to get it. The same melody could sound completely different depending on how you played it. Rushed and mechanical or slow and thoughtful, loud and aggressive or soft and gentle. He found himself thinking about this even when he wasn't at the piano. At work, he'd be carrying lumber or mixing concrete, and he'd be thinking about timing and rhythm. One day, while hammering nails, he realized he was hitting them in the same rhythm as a scale he'd been practicing. Tony caught him smiling and just shook his head with a grin. The piece Mrs. Peterson was teaching him, the one Jennifer had played at their wedding, was called Prelude in E minor by Chopin. When she first showed it to him, it looked impossible. The notes seemed to jump all over the page. His brain couldn't process how anyone could read that and translate it into music. But Mrs. Peterson broke it down. First, just the right hand. then just the left, then slowly, painfully slowly putting them together. She made him practice each section until he could play it without thinking, until his fingers knew the movement by memory. Muscle memory, she explained. Your brain can only process so much, but your muscles, they remember. Practice enough and your hands will know what to do without your brain having to tell them. Some sections came easier than others. There was one part about halfway through where his left hand had to do something completely different from his right hand, and his brain just couldn't coordinate it. He spent an entire week on those 8 measures. 8 measures. He practiced them so many times he heard them in his sleep. Lily started waking up to his practice sessions. He'd hear her bedroom door creak open, and then she'd appear in the doorway in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. She'd sit on the couch and listen, sometimes with a stuffed animal, sometimes just by herself. She never interrupted, never complained about the repetitive sounds of him practicing the same thing over and over. One morning, after he finished his practice and took off the headphones, she was standing right behind him. He jumped, not having heard her approach. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you," she said. "Daddy, you're getting really good. I'm still making a lot of mistakes, kiddo. But you're trying. That's what matters." She climbed up on the bench beside him. "Can I try?" David's heart squeezed. He showed her how to position her hands, how to press the keys gently. Her small fingers were perfect for piano, so much more graceful than his thick, calloused ones. She played a simple scale he'd taught her, and even though it was basic, it was beautiful. "Mommy would be proud of you," Lily said quietly, her fingers still resting on the keys. "I think she'd be proud of both of us," David replied, his voice rough with emotion. After that morning, piano time became something they sometimes did together, not every day, because David needed his solo practice time, but a few times a week Lily would join him. He'd show her simple things and she'd pick them up so quickly it amazed him. She had Jennifer's natural talent, that was clear. Mrs. Peterson noticed too. During one lesson, when Lily came home from school and watched them practice, Mrs. Peterson smiled knowingly. "That child has music in her soul," she said, "just like her mother. When you're ready, David, I'd be happy to teach her too." The idea made David happy and sad at the same time. Happy because Lily deserved to explore this talent, to connect with this part of her mother's legacy. Sad because Jennifer should be here to see it, to teach her daughter herself. But he pushed the sadness aside. Jennifer wasn't here, but he was, and he could make sure Lily had music in her life. As the days passed, David found himself changing in ways that had nothing to do with piano. He started coming home from work with more energy, less exhaustion. He actually wanted to talk to Lily about her day instead of just getting through dinner and bedtime. He started noticing small things again, like the way the light came through their apartment windows in the evening, or how Lily's laugh sounded exactly like Jennifer's. The apartment felt different too. It wasn't sad anymore. It wasn't this place where they were just surviving. Music had brought something back, some sense of being alive instead of just existing. About 2 weeks into his lessons, David's sister Rachel came over for dinner. She brought pizza, and they all sat around the small kitchen table talking. Well, Lily did most of the talking, excitedly telling her aunt about everything happening at school. Rachel kept looking at David with this expression he couldn't quite read. After dinner, while Lily was in her room playing, Rachel pulled him aside. "What happened?" she asked simply. "What do you mean?" "You're different. Both of you are different. Lily's like her old self again. And you're actually smiling. I haven't seen you really smile since before the accident." David felt his throat tighten. "I found a note Jennifer left me. She wanted me to learn piano, so I'm learning." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She pulled him into a hug. "That sounds exactly like something she would do." "God, I miss her." "Me too," David whispered. "Every single day. But you're doing it, David. You're figuring out how to live again. I'm so proud of you." Her words meant more than she probably knew. For 2 years, he'd felt like he was failing at everything. Failing as a dad, failing as a person, barely keeping his head above water. But maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right. The 3rd week, Mrs. Peterson brought up something he wasn't expecting. They were finishing up a lesson, and he'd just played through the entire Chopin piece without stopping. He'd made mistakes, plenty of them, but he'd made it through. "David," she said, putting her hand on his shoulder, "you should perform this." He actually laughed. "Perform? Like in front of people? No way. I'm barely holding it together playing for you." The community center is having their annual talent show in a week. I think you should sign up. Mrs. Peterson, I've been playing piano for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. People who perform have been playing for years. The talent show isn't about being the best, she said gently. It's about sharing something meaningful. And what you're doing here, learning this piece, bringing music back into your daughter's life, that's meaningful. That's worth sharing. David shook his head, anxiety already building at just the thought. I can't, I'd freeze up. I'd mess up. It would be a disaster. Or, Mrs. Peterson said with a knowing smile, it might be exactly what you and Lily need. After she left, David couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea terrified him. Getting up on stage in front of the whole neighborhood, exposing himself like that, it went against every instinct he had. He'd always been the behind-the-scenes guy, the one who did his work and didn't draw attention. That night, he looked up the community center's talent show online. They still had spots open. The show was in exactly 1 week. 1 week to prepare himself mentally for what might be the most terrifying thing he'd ever done. He didn't mention it to Lily. He didn't mention it to anyone. For 3 days, he wrestled with the decision, practicing harder than ever, half preparing for a performance he wasn't sure he'd actually do. Then, on the 4th day, something happened that made the decision for him.
He came home from work to find Lily sitting at the piano.
She wasn't playing, just sitting there with her hands in her lap, staring at the keys. Hey, baby girl, you okay? She looked up at him, and her expression was so serious it worried him. Daddy, can I ask you something? Of course, anything. Are you scared to play piano in front of people? The question caught him off guard. Why do you ask that? Because I heard Mrs. Peterson talking to you last week. About the talent show. And you said no. David sat down beside her on the bench. Yeah, kiddo. I am scared. Really scared. Why? I guess because I'm not very good yet. I make mistakes. I worry people will think I'm silly for trying. Lily thought about this for a moment. Then she said something that broke his heart and put it back together at the same time. Mommy used to tell me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the thing even when you are scared. She said that's what real courage is. David pulled her close, blinking back tears. Jennifer had said that. She'd said it all the time whenever Lily was afraid to try something new. You're right, he said. That's exactly what Mommy used to say. So will you do it? Will you be brave? He looked at his daughter, at her hopeful face, and he knew what his answer had to be. Yeah, he said, his voice shaky but determined. Yeah, I'll do it. Lily's face lit up like the sun coming out from behind clouds. She threw her arms around his neck and squeezed tight. I'm so excited. I'm going to sit in the front row and watch you, and I'm going to clap so loud. That night, after Lily went to bed, David called the community center and signed up for the talent show. His hands shook as he gave them his information. The woman on the phone sounded cheerful and encouraging, saying she couldn't wait to hear him play. After hanging up, David sat at the piano and looked at the music in front of him. 1 week. He had 1 week to prepare for something that might be the bravest or stupidest thing he'd ever done. Maybe both. He put his fingers on the keys and started to practice. David's fingers trembled as they touched the piano keys. The stage lights were hot on his face, making him sweat. The audience had gone completely silent, waiting. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, almost drowning out everything else. For a second, absolute panic hit him. What was he thinking? He'd been playing piano for 3 weeks. 3 weeks! And here he was, about to perform in front of 200 people who actually knew how to judge music. His mind went completely blank. He couldn't remember the first note. Couldn't remember anything except that he was about to humiliate himself in front of everyone. Then his eyes found Lily in the front row. She was sitting on the edge of her seat, leaning forward, her face full of complete trust and excitement. She believed in him. She believed he could do this. Next to her, his sister Rachel gave him a small, encouraging nod. A few seats over, he spotted Mrs. Peterson, her kind eyes telling him everything he needed to hear without saying a word. David took a breath. Then another. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and he could almost hear Jennifer's voice. Music isn't about perfection. It's about feeling. His fingers found the first note, then the second, then the third. The opening of the Chopin piece was gentle, almost whispered. His right hand carried the melody while his left provided the foundation. He'd practiced this beginning so many times it was burned into his muscle memory, but it felt different now, more real, more important. The first few measures were shaky. His timing was slightly off, and he knew it. But he kept going, forcing himself not to stop, not to apologize, not to run away. This was what Mrs. Peterson had taught him. When you make a mistake, you don't stop. You keep playing. The music moves forward, and so do you. As he moved into the second section, something strange started happening. The nervousness didn't disappear exactly, but it shifted. It transformed into something else. Energy, maybe. Focus. His fingers started moving more confidently. The notes began to flow instead of stumble. He opened his eyes and saw the audience. They weren't judging him. They were listening. Really listening. Some of them had their eyes closed. Others were watching his hands on the keys. A few people had tears on their faces, though he couldn't imagine why yet. The piece built to a more complex section, the part that had given him so much trouble during practice. His left hand had to move independently from his right, creating two different melodies that somehow worked together. This was where he usually messed up. This was where his brain would forget to tell his fingers what to do. But tonight, with the lights and the audience and Lily watching, his hands just knew. They moved like they'd been playing this piece for years instead of weeks. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to question it. As the music swelled, David felt something unexpected. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. He was doing it. He was actually doing this thing that had seemed impossible just a month ago. More than that, he was making music. Real music. The kind that moved through the air and touched people's hearts. He thought about Jennifer, about the day she'd played this at their wedding. The memory didn't hurt the way it usually did. Instead, it felt warm, like she was there with him, her hands guiding his, her spirit filling the notes. The piece moved into its most emotional section. The melody became more haunting, more beautiful. This was the part Mrs. Peterson said was about accepting sorrow, about finding beauty in sadness. When he'd first heard that explanation, David hadn't understood it. How could sadness be beautiful? But now, playing it in front of these people, carrying the weight of everything he'd been through in the last 2 years, he got it. The sorrow didn't go away. Losing Jennifer would always hurt. But there was something beautiful in the fact that he'd loved her enough to hurt this much. Something beautiful in the fact that he was still here, still trying, still choosing to make music instead of hiding in silence. His fingers pressed into a series of minor chords that made the hair on his arms stand up. Even though he was the one playing them, they moved him. The sound filled the community center, reaching every corner, touching every person. Then David did something he hadn't planned, something he didn't even know he was going to do until it happened. He started to hum, quietly at first, so quiet it was almost just breath. But then it grew into actual sound, a wordless melody that followed the piano's line. And then, without thinking about it, without planning it, he started to sing. Not the Chopin piece. That didn't have words, but something else. Something that had been buried deep in his memory. The lullaby Jennifer used to sing to Lily every night before bed. The one that started, "Close your eyes, my little star. Mommy's here wherever you are." His voice cracked on the first words. He wasn't a singer. He'd never been a singer. His voice was rough and untrained and probably off-key in places. But it was honest. It was real. And it carried every ounce of love he had for his daughter and his late wife. The piano and the lullaby wove together in a way that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The Chopin piece became the background for Jennifer's lullaby, became the foundation that held up the words. David's voice got stronger as he sang. Not better, but more confident. Dream of sunshine, dream of rain. Dream that Mommy holds you again. When you wake, the world is new and Mommy's love stays here with you. In the front row, Lily's hands flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Actually smiling. Rachel had her arm around Lily's shoulders, and she was crying too. Mrs. Peterson's eyes were closed, her head nodding slightly to the music. David looked out at the audience as he sang, and what he saw shocked him. Nearly everyone was crying. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that happens when something touches you so deeply you can't hold it in. A man in the third row had his arm around his wife. A teenage girl was holding her mother's hand. Even the tough-looking guy by the door was wiping his eyes. The music built toward its climax. David's voice grew louder, filling the space. His fingers flew over the keys, hitting notes he wasn't sure he'd ever hit before. Everything came together in this one perfect moment. The piano, the singing, the lights, the audience. Lily's face, Jennifer's memory, 2 years of grief and struggle and slowly learning how to live again. Close your eyes. My little star, Daddy's here wherever you are. He'd changed the last line. Changed Mommy to Daddy because that's who was here now. That's who would be here, loving Lily, protecting her, making sure she grew up knowing she was cherished. The final notes of the piece approached. David slowed down, letting each note breathe, letting each moment matter. His voice softened back to a hum, then to nothing. Just the piano, just Chopin's beautiful, sorrowful melody saying goodbye. His hands lifted from the keys. The last note hung in the air, vibrating, fading slowly into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The community center was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. David sat frozen at the piano, his hands still hovering above the keys, not sure what to do next. Had it been good? Had it been terrible? He honestly couldn't tell. He'd been so lost in the music, so deep in the emotion of it, that he had no idea how it actually sounded. Then Lily jumped to her feet. She started clapping, fast and loud, her small hands making as much noise as they possibly could. Her face was wet with tears, but she was grinning, absolutely glowing. The audience erupted. Everyone stood up at once, filling the center with thunderous applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was the kind of applause that shakes the walls, the kind that comes from people who've been genuinely moved by something. People were cheering, whistling, some still crying. The sound was overwhelming. David stood up from the piano bench, shaky and disoriented. This couldn't be real. This level of response couldn't be for him, for his imperfect 3-week-old piano playing and his rough, untrained singing. But it was. It really was. Lily didn't wait for him to come down from the stage. She ran up, not caring about the steps or the proper way to do things. She just ran straight to her dad and threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist and squeezing with all her 7-year-old strength. "Daddy, you were amazing," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "You were so amazing." David knelt down and hugged her properly, pulling her close. They stayed like that while the applause continued, while people kept clapping and cheering. He could feel her little heart beating fast against his chest. He could feel his own tears finally coming, the release of all that tension and fear and emotion. "I'm so proud of you," Lily whispered in his ear. "Mommy would be so proud too." "I know, baby girl," David whispered back. "I think she is." Rachel came up on stage next, followed by several other people. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were. An older woman he didn't know grabbed his hand with both of hers. "Young man, I've been coming to these talent shows for 15 years, and that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen here. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us." A middle-aged man with kind eyes approached. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. I have 2 kids. What you did up there, that gave me hope. Thank you." More people came up, each with their own story, their own connection to what he'd done. Some had lost spouses. Some were single parents. Some just understood grief and struggle, and the courage it takes to keep going. Mrs. Peterson was one of the last to reach him. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled him into a hug. When she stepped back, her eyes were red but happy. "Jennifer would be so proud," she said simply. "Not just of your playing, though that was wonderful, but of your courage, of your heart, of the father you've become." David couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat too tight with emotion. The show had to go on. There were more performers waiting. But as David walked off the stage with Lily's hand in his, the applause followed them. People kept clapping until they reached their seats in the audience. They sat down and Lily immediately curled up against his side. David put his arm around her, holding her close. His heart was still racing. His hands were still shaking. But inside, something had shifted. Something heavy he'd been carrying for 2 years had gotten just a little bit lighter. The next performer came on stage, a teenager doing a magic act. The show continued. But David barely saw it. He was too busy processing what had just happened, too busy holding his daughter, too busy feeling the warmth of knowing he'd done something meaningful. During intermission, David's phone buzzed, then buzzed again. And again. He pulled it out and saw dozens of messages. Friends who'd been in the audience. Co-workers who'd heard about it. Jennifer's parents, who Rachel had apparently called immediately. One text from Tony, his foreman, just said, "Saw the video someone posted. I'm buying lunch tomorrow. Proud of you, kid. There was a video. Someone had recorded it." The thought made David's stomach flip. But also strangely, it made him happy. Maybe other people who needed to see it would see it. Maybe other people struggling with grief would find some hope in it. The second half of the talent show went by in a blur. When they announced the winners at the end, David was shocked to hear his name called for the audience favorite award. Lily shrieked with excitement, jumping up and down. He went back on stage, accepted a small trophy, and mumbled a few words of thanks that probably didn't make much sense. As they left the community center that night, walking into the cool evening air, Lily held the trophy in one hand and David's hand in the other. She skipped along beside him, humming the lullaby he'd sung. "Daddy," she said as they reached their car. "Yeah, kiddo? Can we play piano together tomorrow? I want to learn that song." David smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, baby girl. We can play together tomorrow." And they would. Tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Because music had found its way back into their home. Because courage had found its way back into his heart. Because life, despite all its pain and loss, was still worth living, still worth trying, still worth making beautiful. Jennifer had known that. She'd left him that note, that bridge, that permission to begin again. And tonight he'd finally crossed it.